Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's Stories. We now return to Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. Chapter 4, Betsy Goes to School. Elizabeth Ann was very much surprised to hear Cousin Anne's voice calling, "Dinner!" down the stairs. It did not seem possible that the whole morning had gone by. "Here," said Aunt Abigail, "just put that pat on a plate, will you, and take it upstairs as you go. I've got all I can do to haul my own 200 pounds up without any half-pound of butter into the bargain." The little girl smiled at this, though she did not exactly know why, and skipped up the stairs proudly with her butter. Dinner was smoking on the table, which was set in the midst of the great pool of sunlight. A very large black and white dog with a great bushy tail was walking around and around the table, sniffing the air. He looked as big as a bear to Elizabeth Ann, and as he walked, his great red tongue hung out of his mouth, and his white teeth gleamed horribly. Elizabeth Ann shrank back in terror, clutching her plate of butter to her breast with tense fingers. Cousin Ann said over her shoulder, "Oh, bother. There's old Shep got up to pester us begging for scraps. Shep, you go and lie down this minute." To Elizabeth Ann's astonishment and immense relief, the great animal turned, drooping his head sadly, walked back across the floor, got upon the couch again, and laid his head down on one paw, very forlornly, turning up the whites of his eyes meekly at Cousin Ann. Aunt Abigail, who had just pulled herself up the stairs, panting, said between laughing and puffing, "I'm glad I'm not an animal on this farm. Ann does boss them around so." "Well, somebody has to," said Cousin Ann, advancing on a table with a platter. This proved to have chicken fricassee.
Fricassee.
This proved to have chicken fricassee on it. Fricassee, a dish of stewed or fried pieces of meat served in a thick white sauce. Fricassee. This proved to have chicken fricassee on it, and Elizabeth Ann's heart melted in her at the smell. She loved chicken gravy on hot biscuits beyond anything in the world. But chickens are so expensive when you buy them in the market that Aunt Harriet hadn't had them very often for dinner. And there was a plate of biscuits, golden brown, just coming out of the oven. She sat down very quickly, her mouth watering, and attacked with extreme haste the big plateful of food which Cousin Ann passed her. And attacked with extreme haste the big plateful of food which Cousin Ann passed her. At Aunt Harriet's, she had always been aware that everybody watched her anxiously as she ate, and she had heard so much about her light appetite that she felt she must live up to her reputation, and had a very natural and human hesitation about eating all she wanted when there happened to be something she liked very much. But nobody here knew that she only ate enough to keep a bird alive, and that her appetite was so capricious. Nor did anybody notice her while she stowed away the chicken and gravy and hot biscuits and courant jelly and baked potatoes and apple pie. When did Elizabeth Ann ever eat such a meal before? She actually felt her belt grow tight. In the middle of the meal, Cousin Ann got up to answer the telephone, which was in the next room. The instant the door had closed behind her, Uncle Henry leaned forward, tapped Elizabeth Ann on the shoulder and nodded toward the sofa. His eyes were twinkling, and as for Aunt Abigail, she began to laugh silently, shaking all over, her napkin at her mouth to stifle the sound. Elizabeth Ann turned wonderingly and saw the old dog cautiously and noiselessly letting himself down from the sofa, one ear cocked rigidly in the direction of Cousin Anne's voice in the next room. The old tack," said Uncle Henry. He always sneaks up to the table to be fed if Anne goes out for a minute. Here, Betsy, you're nearest. Give him this piece of skin from the chicken neck." The big dog padded forward across the room, evidently in such a state of terror about Cousin Anne that Elizabeth Ann felt for him. She had a fellow feeling about that relative of hers. Also, it was impossible to be afraid of so abjectly meek and guilty an animal. As old Shep came up to her, poking his nose inquiringly on her lap, she shrinkingly held out the big piece of skin, and though she jumped back at the sudden snap and gobbling gulp with which the old dog greeted the tidbit, she could not but sympathize with his evident enjoyment of it. He waved his bushy tail gratefully, cocked his head on one side and his ears standing up at attention, his eyes glistening greedily. He gave a little begging whine. Oh, he's asking for more," cried Elizabeth Ann, surprised to see how plainly she could understand dog talk. "Quick, Uncle Henry, give me another piece." Uncle Henry rapidly transferred to her plate a wing bone from his own, and Aunt Abigail, with one deft swoop, contributed the neck from the platter. As fast as she could, Elizabeth Ann fed these to Shep, who woofed them down at top speed, the bones crunching loudly under his strong white teeth. How he did enjoy it! It did your heart good to see his gusto. There was the sound of the telephone receiver being hung up in the next room, and everybody acted at once. Aunt Abigail began drinking innocently out of a coffee cup, only her laughing old eyes showing over the rim. Uncle Henry buttered a slice of bread with a grave face, as though he were deep in conjectures about who would be next president. And as for old Shep, he made one plunge across the room, his toenails clicking rapidly on the bare floor, sprang up on the couch. And when Cousin Anne opened the door and came in, he was lying in exactly the position in which she had left him. His paw stretched out, his head laid on it, his brown eyes turned up meekly so that the whites showed. I've told you what these three did, but I haven't told you yet what Elizabeth Ann did, and it is worth telling. As Cousin Anne stepped in, glancing suspiciously from a sober-faced and abstracted parents to the lamb-like innocence of old Shep, little Elizabeth Ann burst into a shout of laughter. It's worth telling about, because so far as I know, that was the first time she had ever laughed out heartily in all her life. For my part, I'm half surprised to know that she knew how. Of course, when she laughed, Aunt Abigail had to laugh too, setting down her coffee cup and showing all the funny wrinkles in her face, screwed up hard with fun, and that made Uncle Henry laugh. And then Cousin Anne laughed and said as she sat down, "You are bad children, the whole four of you." And old Shep, seeing the state of things, stopped pretending to be meek, jumped down and came lumbering over to the table, wagging his tail and laughing too. You know that good white dog smile? He put his head on Elizabeth Ann's lap again, and she patted it and lifted up one of his big black ears. She had quite forgotten that she was terribly afraid of big dogs. After dinner, Cousin Ann looked up at the clock and said, "My goodness, Betsy'll be late for school if she doesn't start right off," she explained to the child, aghast at this sudden thunderclap. "I let you sleep this morning as long as you wanted to because you were so tired from your journey, but of course there's no reason for missing the afternoon session." As Elizabeth Ann continued sitting perfectly still, frozen with alarm, Cousin Ann jumped up briskly, got the little coat and cap, helped her up, and began inserting the child's arms into the sleeves. She pulled the cap well down over Elizabeth Ann's ears, felt in the pocket, and pulled out the mittens. "There," she said, holding them out. "You'd better put them on before you go out, for it's a real cold day." As she led the stupefied little girl along toward the door, Aunt Abigail came after them and put a big sugar cookie into the child's hand. "Maybe you'll like to eat that for your recess time," she said. "I always did when I went to school." Elizabeth Ann's hand closed automatically about the cookie, but she scarcely heard what was said. She felt herself to be in a bad dream. Aunt Frances had never let her go to school alone, and on the first day of the year always took her to the new teacher and introduced her and told the teacher how sensitive she was and how hard to understand. And then she stayed there for an hour or two till Elizabeth Ann got used to things. She could not face a whole new school all alone. Oh, she couldn't, and she wouldn't. She couldn't. Horrors. Here she was in the front hall. She was on the porch. Cousin Ann was saying, "Now run along, child, straight down the road till the first turn on the left, and there in the crossroads, there you are." And now the front door closed behind her. The path stretched before her to the road, and the road led down the hill the way Cousin Ann had pointed. Elizabeth Ann's feet began to move forward and carried her down the path, although she was still crying out to herself, "I can't, I won't, I can't." Are you wondering why Elizabeth Ann didn't turn right around, open the front door, walk in, and say, "I can't, I won't, I can't" to Cousin Ann? The answer to that question is that she didn't do it because Cousin Ann was Cousin Ann. And there's more in that than you think. In fact, there is a mystery in it that nobody has ever solved, not even the greatest scientists and philosophers. Although, like all scientists and philosophers, they think they have gone a long way toward explaining something they don't understand by calling it a long name. The long name is personality. And what it means, nobody knows. But it is perhaps the very most important thing in the world for all that. And yet we know only one or two things about it. We know that somebody's personality is made up of the sum total of all the actions and thoughts and desires of his life. And we know that though there aren't any words or any figures in any language to set down that sum total accurately, still it is one of the first things that everybody knows about anybody else. And that is really all we know. So I can't tell you why Elizabeth Ann did not go back and cry and sob and say she couldn't and she wouldn't and she couldn't, as she would certainly have done at Aunt Harriet's. You remember that I could not even tell you why it was that. As the little fatherless and motherless girl lay in bed looking at Aunt Abigail's old face, she should feel so comforted and protected that she must needs break out crying. No, all I can say is that it was because Aunt Abigail was Aunt Abigail. But perhaps it may occur to you that it's rather a good idea to keep a sharp eye on your personality. Whatever that is, it might be very handy, to have a personality like Cousin Ann's, which sent Elizabeth Ann's feet down the path, Or perhaps you would prefer one like Aunt Abigail's. Well, take your choice. You must not, of course, think for a moment that Elizabeth Ann had the slightest intention of obeying Cousin Anne. No, indeed. Nothing was farther from her mind as her feet carried her along the path and into the road. In her mind was nothing but rebellion and fear, and anger, and oh, such hurt feelings. She turned sick at the very thought of facing all the staring, curious faces in the playground turned on the new scholar as she had seen them at home. She would never do it. She would walk around all afternoon and then go back and tell Cousin Anne that she couldn't. She would explain to her how Aunt Frances never let her go out of doors without a loving hand to cling to. She would explain to her how Aunt Frances always took care of her. It was easier to think about what she would say and do and explain away from Cousin Anne than it was to say and do it before those black eyes. Aunt Frances's eyes were soft, light blue. Oh, how she wanted Aunt Frances to take care of her. Nobody cared a thing about her. Nobody understood her but Aunt Frances. She wouldn't go back at all to Putney Farm. She would just walk on till she was lost. And the night would come, and she would lie down and freeze to death. And then wouldn't Cousin Anne feel? Someone called to her. "Isn't this Betsy?" She looked up astonished. A young girl in a gingham dress and a white apron like those at Putney Farm stood in front of a tiny square building like a toy house. "Isn't this Betsy?" asked the young girl again. "Your Cousin Anne said you were coming to school today, and I've been looking out for you, but I saw you going right by and I ran out to stop you." "Why, where is the school?" asked Betsy, staring around for a big brick four-story building. The young girl laughed and held out her hand. "This is the school," she said, "and I am the teacher, and you'd better come right in, for it's time to begin." She led Betsy into a low-ceilinged room with geraniums at the windows, where about a dozen children of different ages sat behind their desks. At the first sight of them, Betsy blushed crimson with fright and shyness, and hung down her head. But looking out the corners of her eyes, she saw that they too were all very red-faced and scared-looking, and hung down their heads, looking at her shyly out of the corners of their eyes. She was so surprised by this that she forgot all about herself and looked inquiringly at the teacher. "They don't see many strangers," the teacher explained, "and they feel very shy and scared when a new scholar comes, especially one from the city." "Is this my grade?" asked Elizabeth, thinking it the very smallest grade she had ever seen. "This is the whole school," said the teacher. "There are only 2 or 3 in each class. You'll probably have 3 in yours. Miss Anne said you were in the 3rd grade. There, that's your seat." Elizabeth sat down before a very old desk, much battered and hacked up with knife marks. There was a big H.P. carved just over the inkwell, and many other initials scattered all over the top. The teacher stepped back to her desk and took up a violin that lay there. "Now, children, we'll begin the afternoon session by singing America," she said. She played the air over a little very sweetly and stirringly. And then as the children stood up, she came down to close to, she came down close to them, standing just in front of Betsy. She drew the bow across the strings in a big chord and said, "Now," and Betsy burst into song with the others. The sun came in the windows brightly, the teacher too sang as she played, and all the children, even the littlest ones, opened their mouths wide and sang lustily. Chapter 5. What grade is Betsy? After the singing, the teacher gave Elizabeth Ann a pile of school books, some paper, some pencils, and a pen, and told her to set her desk in order. There were more initials carved inside, another big H, P, with a little A and P under it. What a lot of children must have sat there, thought the little girl as she arranged her books and papers. As she shut down the lid, the teacher finished giving some instructions to 3 or 4 little ones and said, "Betsy and Ralph and Ellen, bring your reading books up here." Betsy sighed, took out her 3rd grade reader, and went with the other 2 up to the battered old bench near the teacher's desk. She knew all about reading lessons, and she hated them, although she loved to read. But reading lessons, you sat with your book open at some reading that you could do with your eyes shut. It was so easy, and you waited and waited and waited while your classmates slowly stumbled along, reading aloud a sentence or 2 apiece, until your turn came to stand up and read your sentence or 2, which by that time sounded just like nonsense, because you'd read it over and over so many times to yourself before your chance came. And often you didn't even have a chance to do that, because the teacher didn't have time to get around to you at all, and you closed your book and put it back in your desk without having opened your mouth. Reading was one thing Elizabeth Ann had learned to do very well indeed, but she had learned it all by herself at home, from much reading to herself. Aunt Frances had kept her well supplied with children's books from the nearest public library. She often read 3 a week, very different. That from a sentence or 2, once or twice a week. When she sat down on the battered old bench, she almost laughed aloud. It seemed so funny to be in a class of only 3. There had been 40 in her grade in the big brick building. She sat in the middle, the little girl whom the teacher had called Ellen on one side and Ralph on the other. Ellen was pretty, with fair hair smoothly braided in 2 little pigtails, sweet blue eyes, and a clean blue and white gingham dress. Ralph had very black eyes, dark hair, a big bruise on his forehead, a cut on his chin, and a tear in the knee of his short trousers. He was much bigger than Ellen, and Elizabeth Ann thought he looked rather fierce. She decided that she would be afraid of him and would not like him at all. "Page 32, said the teacher. "Ralph first." Ralph stood up and began to read. It sounded very familiar to Elizabeth Ann, for he did not read at all well. What was not familiar was that the teacher did not stop him after the first sentence. He read on and on till he had read a page, the teacher only helping him with the hardest words. "Now, Betsy," said the teacher. Elizabeth Ann stood up, read the first sentence, and paused, like a caged lion pausing when he comes to the end of his cage. "Go on," said the teacher. Elizabeth Ann read the next sentence and stopped again automatically. "Go on," said the teacher, looking at her sharply. The next time the little girl paused, the teacher laughed out good-naturedly. "What is the matter with you, Betsy?" she said. "Go on till I tell you to stop." So Elizabeth Ann, very much surprised but very much interested, read on, sentence after sentence, till she forgot they were sentences and just thought of what they meant. She read a whole page and then another page, and that was the end of the selection. She had never read aloud so much in her life. She was aware that everybody in the room had stopped working to listen to her. She felt very proud and less afraid than she had ever thought she could be in a schoolroom. When she finished, "You read very well," said the teacher. "Is this very easy for you?" "Oh, yes," said Elizabeth Ann. "I guess, then, that you'd better not stay in this class," said the teacher. She took a book out of her desk. "See if you can read that." Elizabeth Ann began in her usual school reading style, very slow and monotonous. But this didn't seem like a reader at all. It was poetry, full of hard words that were fun to try to pronounce. And it was all about an old woman who would hang out an American flag, even though the town was full of rebel soldiers. She read faster and faster, getting more and more excited, till she broke out with, "Halt!" in such a loud, spirited voice that the sound of it startled her and made her stop, fearing that she would be laughed at. But nobody laughed. They were all listening very eagerly, even the little ones with their eyes turned toward her. "You might as well go on and let us see how it came out," said the teacher, and Betsy finished triumphantly. "Well," said the teacher, "there's no sense in your reading along in the third reader. After this, you'll recite out of the seventh reader with Frank and Harry and Stacy." Elizabeth Ann could not believe her ears. To be jumped 4 grades in that casual way. It wasn't possible. She at once thought, however, of something that would prevent it entirely. And while Ellen was reading her page in a slow, careful little voice, Elizabeth Ann was feeling miserably that she must explain to the teacher why she couldn't read with the 7th grade children. Oh, how she wished she could. When they stood up to go back to their seats, she hesitated, hung her head, and looked very unhappy. "Did you want to say something to me?" asked the teacher, pausing with a bit of chalk in her hand. The little girl went up to her desk and said what she knew it was her duty to confess. "I can't be allowed to read in the 7th reader. I don't write a bit well, and I never get the mental number work right. I couldn't do anything with 7th grade arithmetic." The teacher looked a little blank and said, "I didn't say anything about your number work. I don't know anything about it. You haven't recited yet." She turned away and began to write a list of words on the board. "Betsy, Ralph, and Ellen, study their spelling," she said. "You little ones come up for your reading." The 2 little boys and 2 little girls came forward as Elizabeth Ann began to con over the words on the board. At first she found she was listening to the little chirping voices as the children struggled with their reading instead of studying doubt, travel, cheese, and the other words in her lesson. But she put her hands over her ears and her mind on her spelling. She wanted to make a good impression with that lesson. After a while, when she was sure she could spell them all correctly, she began to listen and look around her. She always got her spelling in less time than was allowed the class, and usually sat idle looking out of the window until that study period was over. But now, the moment she stopped staring at the board and moving her lips as she spelled to herself, the teacher said, just as though she had been watching her every minute instead of conducting a class, "Betsy, have you learned your spelling?" "Yes, ma'am, I think so," said Elizabeth Ann, wondering very much why she was asked. "That's fine," said the teacher. "I wish you'd take little Molly over in that corner and help her with her reading. She's getting on so much better than the rest of the class that I hate to have her lose her time. Just hear her read the rest of her little story, will you? And don't help her unless she's really stuck." Elizabeth Ann was startled by this request, which was unheard of in her experience. She was very uncertain of herself as she sat down on a low chair in the corner of the schoolroom, away from the desks, with the little child leaning on her knee. And yet she was not exactly afraid either, because Molly was such a shy little roly-poly thing, with her crop of yellow curls and her bright blue eyes very serious as she looked hard at the book and began. Once there was a rat. It was a fat rat. No, it was impossible. It was impossible to be frightened of such a funny little girl who peered so earnestly into the older child's face to make sure she was doing her lesson right. Elizabeth Ann had never had anything to do with younger children than herself. Elizabeth Ann had never had anything to do with children younger than herself, and she felt very pleased and important to have anybody look up to her. She put her arm round Molly's square, warm, fat little body and gave her a squeeze. Molly snuggled up closer, and the two children put their heads together over the printed page. Elizabeth Ann corrected Molly very gently indeed when she made a mistake, and waiting patiently when she hesitated. She had so fresh in her mind her own suffering from quick, nervous corrections that she took the greatest pleasure in speaking quietly and not interrupting the little girl more than was necessary. It was fun to teach. Lots of fun. She was surprised when the teacher said, "Well, Betsy, how did Molly do?" "Oh, is the time up?" said Elizabeth Ann. "Why, she does beautifully, I think, for such a little thing." "Do you suppose," said the teacher thoughtfully, just as though Betsy were a grown-up person, "do you suppose she could go into the second reader with Eliza? There's no use keeping her in the first if she's ready to go on." Elizabeth Ann's head whirled with this second light-handed juggling with the sacred distinction between the grades. In the big brick schoolhouse, nobody ever went into another grade except at the beginning of a new year, after you'd passed a lot of examinations. She had not known that anybody could do anything else. The idea that everybody took a year to a grade, no matter what, was so fixed in her mind that she felt as though the teacher had said, "How would you like to stop being 9 years old and be 12 instead? And don't you think Molly would better be 8 instead of 6? However, just then her class in arithmetic was called, so that she had no more time to be puzzled. She came forward with Ralph and Ellen again, very low in her mind. She hated arithmetic with all her might, and she really didn't understand a thing about it. By long experience, she had learned to read her teachers' faces very accurately, and she guessed by their expression whether the answer she gave was the right one, and that was the only way she could tell. You never heard of any other child who did that, did you? They had mental arithmetic, of course. Elizabeth Ann thought it just her luck. And of course it was those hateful 8s and 7s. And of course right away poor Betsy got the one she hated most. 7 times 8. She never knew that one. She said dispiritedly that it was 54, remembering vaguely that it was somewhere in the 50s. Ralph burst out scornfully, 56! And the teacher, as if she wanted to take him down for showing off, pounced on him with a 9 times 8. He answered without drawing breath, 72! Elizabeth Ann shuddered at his accuracy. Ellen too rose to the occasion when she got 6 times 7, which Elizabeth Ann could sometimes remember and sometimes not. And then, oh horrors, it was her turn again. Her turn had never before come more than twice during a mental arithmetic lesson. She was so startled by the swiftness with which the questions went around that she balked on 6 times 6, which she knew perfectly. And before she could recover, Ralph had answered, and had rattled out 108 in answer to 9 times 12. And then Ellen slapped down a 80 foul on top of a 7 times 12. Good gracious, who could have guessed? From the way they read, they could do their tables like this. She herself missed on 7 times 7 and was ready to cry. After this, the teacher didn't call on her at all, but showered questions down on the other two, who sent the answers back with sickening speed. After the lesson, the teacher said, smiling, "Well, Betsy, you were right about your arithmetic. I guess you'd better recite with Eliza for a while. She's doing 2nd grade work. I shouldn't be surprised if, after a good review with her, you'd be able to go on with the 3rd grade work." Elizabeth Ann fell back on the bench with her mouth open. She felt dizzy. What crazy things, the teacher said. She felt as though she was being pulled limb from limb. "What's the matter?" asked the teacher, seeing her bewildered face. Why, said Elizabeth Ann. "I don't know what I am at all. If I'm 2nd grade arithmetic and 7th grade reading and 3rd grade spelling, what grade am I?" The teacher laughed at the turn of her phrase. "You aren't any grade at all, no matter where you are in school. You're just yourself, aren't you? What difference does it make what grade you're in? And what's the use of your reading little baby things too easy for you just because you don't know your multiplication table?" "Well, for goodness sakes!" ejaculated Elizabeth Ann, feeling very much as though somebody had stood her suddenly on her head. "Why, what's the matter?" asked the teacher again. This time Elizabeth Ann didn't answer, because she herself didn't know what the matter was. But I do, and I'll tell you. The matter was that never before had she known what she was doing in school. She had always thought she was there to pass from one grade to another, and she was ever so startled to get a little glimpse of the fact that she was there to learn how to read and write and cipher and generally use her mind so she could take care of herself when she came to be grown up. Of course, she didn't really know that till she did come to be grown up. But she had her first dim notion of it in that moment, and it made her feel the way you do when you're learning to skate and somebody pulls away the chair you've been leaning on and says, "Now go it alone." The teacher waited a minute, and then when Elizabeth Ann didn't say anything more, she rang a little bell. "Recess time! Clang, 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 clang," she said. And as the children marched out and began putting on their wraps, she followed them into the cloakroom, pulled on a warm red cap and a red sweater, and ran outdoors herself. "Who's on my side?" she called, and the children came darting out after her. Elizabeth Ann had dreaded the first recess time with the strange children, but she had no time to feel shy, for in a twinkling she was on one end of a long rope with a lot of her schoolmates, pulling with all her might against the teacher and 2 of the big boys. Nobody had looked at her curiously. Nobody had said anything to her beyond a loud, "Come on, Betsy," from Ralph, who was at the head on their side. They pulled and they pulled, digging their feet into the ground and bracing themselves against the rocks which stuck up out of the playground. Sometimes the teacher side yanked them along by quick jerks, and then they'd all set their feet hard when Ralph shouted out, "Now all together!" And they'd slowly drag the other side back. And all the time everybody was shouting and yelling together with the excitement. Betsy was screaming too. And when a wagon passing by stopped and a big broad-shouldered farmer jumped down laughing, put the end of the rope over his shoulder and just walked off with the whole lot of them till he had pulled them clear off their feet. Elizabeth Ann found herself rolling over and over with a breathless, squirming mass of children, her shrill laughter rising even above the shouts of merriment of the others. She laughed so she could hardly get up on her feet again. It was such an unexpected ending to the contest. The big farmer was laughing too. You ain't so smart as you think you are you? He jeered at them good-naturedly. Then he started yelling, "Whoa there!" to his horses, which had begun to walk on. He had to run after them with all his might and just climbed into the back of the wagon and grabbed the reins the very moment they broke into a trot. The children laughed. And Ralph shouted after him, "Hi there, Uncle Nate." "Who's not so smart as he think he is now?" He turned to the little girls near him. "They most got away from him that time," he said. "He's awful foolish about leaving them standing while he's funning or something. He thinks he's awful funny anyhow. Someday they'll run away on him, and then where'll he be?" Elizabeth Ann was thinking to herself that this was one of the queerest things that had happened to her, even in this queer place. Never once had any grown-up passing the playground of the big brick building dreamed of such a thing as stopping for a minute to play. They never even looked at the children any more than if they were in another world. In fact, she had felt the school was in another world. "Ralph, it's your turn to get the water," said the teacher, handing him a pail. "Want to go along?" said Ralph gruffly to Ellen and Betsy. He led the way, and the little girls walked after him. Now that she was out of a crowd, Elizabeth Ann felt all her shyness come down on her, like a black cloud, drying up her mouth and turning her hands and feet cold as ice. Into one of these cold hands she felt small, warm fingers inside. She looked down, and there was little Molly trotting by her side, turning her blue eyes up trustfully. "Teacher says I can go with you if you'll take care of me," she said. "She never lets us first graders go without somebody bigger to help us over the log." As she spoke, they came to a small, clear, swift brook crossed by a big white birch log. Elizabeth Ann was horribly afraid to set foot on it, but with little Molly's hand holding tightly to hers, she was ashamed to say she was afraid. Ralph skipped across, swinging the pail to show how easy it was for him. Ellen followed more slowly, and then, oh, don't you wish Aunt Frances could have been there? Betsy shut her teeth together hard, put Molly ahead of her, took her hand, and started across. As a matter of fact, Molly went along as sure-footed as a little goat, having done it 100 times, and it was she who steadied Elizabeth Ann. But nobody knew this, Molly least of all. Ralph took a drink out of a tin cup standing on a stump nearby, dipped the pail into a deep, clear pool, and started back to the school. Ellen took a drink and offered the cup to Betsy, very shyly, without looking up. After they had all three had a drink, they stood there for a moment, much embarrassed. Then Ellen said in a very small voice, "Do you like dolls with yellow hair the best?" Now it happened that Elizabeth Ann had very positive convictions on this point, which she had never spoken of, because Aunt Frances didn't really care about dolls. She only pretended to be company for her little niece. "No, I don't," answered the little girl emphatically. "I get just sick and tired of always seeing them with that old bright yellow hair. I'd like them to have brown hair, just the way most little girls really do." Ellen lifted her eyes and smiled radiantly. "Oh, so do I," she said. "And that lovely old doll your folks have has got brown hair. Would you let me play with her sometime?" "My folks?" said Elizabeth Ann blankly. "Why, yes, your Aunt Abigail and your Uncle Henry." Have they got a doll? Said Betsy, thinking this was the very climax of Putney queerness. Oh my, yes, said Molly eagerly. She's the one Mrs. Putney had when she was a little girl, and she's got the loveliest clothes. She's in the hair trunk under the eaves in the attic. They let me take her down once when I was there with Mother, and Mother said she guessed now a little girl had come there to live. They let her have her down all the time. I'll bring mine over next Saturday if you want me to. Mine's got yellow hair, but she's real pretty anyhow. If Father's going to mill that day, he can leave me there for the morning. Elizabeth Ann had not understood more than 1 word in 5 of this, but just then the school bell rang and they went back. Little Molly helping Elizabeth Ann over the log and thinking she was being helped as before. They ran along to the little building, and there I'm going to leave them, because I think I've told enough about their school for one while. It was only a poor, rough, little district school anyway, that no superintendent of schools would have looked at for a minute, except to sniff.